the best programs to use to create first of all, to create the magazine itself, but to edit the photos as well, or the best, most professional one. Because you could just use, say, the tool on your phone or something, but it's not going to do it great, and it edits them automatically anyway, so it wouldn't be that good. Moving on for the hardware part of this, I have talked about using our Mac at school, plus the one I have at home, a Canon DSLR 800, the 50 prime lens, the 18-50 lens on my own phone, and the 70 to 200 lens. So these were they were quite, I didn't use them loads, but for example, the Mac, I used that to use my programs and access and store all of my work and just generally edit and do the most of the work for this preliminary stage. For the Canon camera, I took all the photos on that, and obviously then the 3 lenses which I mentioned I used on the camera as well to take these photos. Then I mentioned that my phone, because I needed to use that for a podcast. I know that you can use like a proper microphone, but at the time this just seemed like the best idea for me. So that's what I used. Okay. I think that all of these worked quite well, quite nicely, because they are all Apple, or they all work with Apple, so it makes everything easy to run with, let's say. And it all links together, and it's easy just to have everything the same. And they link. So for the link, as this all came to be for one overall thing, it just linked it together nicely to create this magazine, or this starter basis which we had to do, which is quite nice. I think that it's convenient as it does show like a starting basis and where everything can be tracked from that point. If that's including the editing skills, to the cutting out, to the using of InDesign itself, to the using of Photoshop, to the use of camera, like angles and lighting, and the sort of pictures which you take as well. I think that counts for a lot. But then it's also to see how you take your ideas and then you create them to then go, right, well, this isn't exactly what I intended, but it's okay. It's okay. Then moving on for the online section of my preliminary task. So I based this on the Kellett, or on Kellett, as though it was like a magazine which would be sent out to everyone. So as I was new when we created this, I didn't really know much about Kellett. So I used Kellett's website to find out the sorts of, well, just a few key facts which would be quite nice to include, such as what departments they have, what facilities they have, what's their grades and everything are, and what some latest stuff which they were all doing, and just little bits and bobs which I wouldn't have known. Then for also online, I used Google Slides. Okay, so moving on to the research. Again, I'm going to be talking about the software, hardware, and online. So for the software, I mentioned that we had screencasts, we used Premiere, we used Final Cut Pro, and podcasts. Okay, so For the screencasts, this was dotted around, if I'm honest. So I used a few on my peer assessments. And then on the SBF front cover and contents page and double page spread, like just in a few different places. So I think that because I've got this dotted around, it does balance it all out, and yeah. So I think that worked quite well. Moving on to Premiere. So this and Final Cut Pro are both programs which you are able to use to edit and cut videos together. So Premiere is available at school, but I don't have it at home. So if I needed to edit a video at school, that's what I would use. So I ended up using both of these in my research section. And I think Premiere is probably more professional, but personally I found Final Cut Pro a bit more easier to understand and get my head around. Although I did understand and get my head around, Premiere. So I think it's interesting to see that I have tried out different things and that I did get a bit of variation in there, which is always a good thing. Obviously, I got a few podcasts in there just to speak and to write up all of the text, so then it wouldn't just be writing, which can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes. Anyway, so I think that they did work well in this case, because it meant that I didn't just write loads and loads, because the research stage is pretty important, as that's where you get to find out a lot of things. And personally, I don't like reading loads of text if I'm trying to go back and remember what I've written in places. So I found if I could listen to, say, a 3-minute podcast to sum up a page, that would be a lot more appealing, in my opinion, which is always a good thing. And I think that they integrated quite well, because of their embedding links and just the connections between them. But I'm going to come back to that when I go on to the online bit. So moving on to the hardware, again, we use the Mac at school and at home, the Canon DSLR 800 and my phone. So this is pretty much the same. So I use the Mac and my phone basically to find photos or locations where I wanted to go. And yeah, I think this just, obviously, any access to the internet does make it a lot easier, and this is pretty easy to use. When it came to the camera, this was more towards the end of my research, so I'd figure out what sort of images I wanted to use by this point, where I wanted to use them, why I'm using them. I'd figured out all of that, so I thought that I would have a recreational, or I can't remember what I called it. Just give me a second. Oh, wrong section. Ignore me. Anyway, so that's what I use for my research for the hardware. Moving on to the online, obviously I use different websites and different links and everything, so then I could find out the sorts of images which I wanted to include and use and just do all of that. So normal, just online searches and everything. Then I use quite a lot of Google Slides, actually. Like, this became one of my favourite things to use, if you look back. I think this is because I prefer the layout of it than Google Docs or Google Sheets or anything like that. I think it looks a little bit more professional out of all of them, so that's why I did that. I also started to use embedding links, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. And this was basically just so then I could link a few different pages together. So ones which were quite similar or included some of the same sort of things. It just made it a bit more cohesive and all together, which is always a good thing. Okay, so moving on to the planning. This was by far the most difficult and long section to do. Well, at least in my opinion, but we're dealing with it. So for the software, I mentioned the Photos, Premiere, Photoshop, Podcast, Screencast, Bridge, and Final Cut Pro. So by this point, I have used all of them software except for Bridge, which was a new one actually, which I found out from the art department, which was quite nice. Anyway, so in the planning, the photos, which were mine, came towards the end, just so then I could have that page, which I named Recreating Photos. So this was where I took some of the photos which I found during my research stage, and I recreated them to the best ability which I could, while taking into account the lighting, the angles, the rule of thirds and all of that. So I think that was quite interesting. So again, I use Premiere and Final Cut Pro pretty much in sync, just so then I could have them going on at the same time, and it made life a little bit easier. So depending on where I was, I would always be able to be editing something. It's just good practice, to be honest. Then I used Photoshop. This was mainly on the images actually. I didn't go overboard at this point because it was still the planning. So it's more like development yet. So we shouldn't be doing too much of that, which was fine. Then podcasts, again, this was just so then I didn't have loads and loads of text. Like now, it would take me a very long time to write everything which I'm saying. So a podcast does make it quite easy just to include everything which I wanted to. As let's be honest, you are able to speak a lot quicker than you are to type, which is just something to consider. Okay, so Screencast was the second to last. This was, again, just while I was going through all of my work, and if I wanted to show something on the computer, this allowed me to let the audience see what I was seeing, but then point out different aspects and everything. So I thought that was quite good. Finally, I used Bridge. Now, I didn't really get what this was at first, but basically, it's a really good and easy way to see all of your photos which you've taken, as it doesn't... So, for example, when you're on your Apple stuff, you go into photos, you have all of them, but there's like that 1 second when it doesn't really... It's not really any photo in particular. It's just that black screen, which I suppose isn't the end of the world, but it makes it quite difficult when you're trying to see and compare photos. So basically, this program lets you see your photos without dealing with that. So it uploads them all to like a pretty good standards as well, and then you can have a look at them. I found that this is more helpful for raw images rather than JPEG, but it's not the end of the world. It can still be used quite well. Moving on to hardware for planning, I use the Canon DSLR, the portable flashes, the diffusers, like the umbrella one, my phone, a Mac, the NAS, a scanner, and a whiteboard. So I'm just going to go through these one at a time and explain why and how. So for the first, the Canon, this was again towards the end, just so then I could get in some practice for the photos, because I didn't want to start my magazine without having taken some practices, if not at all any. This is again when I used the portable flashes and the umbrella diffuser, as I needed to make sure that I got my lighting right, and these two allowed me to. I was actually quite happy with these images, and looking back, I don't know why I didn't include them, because they were really nice outside images. I think I was a fool not to use them, but anyway, doesn't matter. So going on to my phone, I use my phone again for the podcast just because it's convenient, it's easy, and yeah, it was just there and then. Quite easy. Then moving on to the Mac. This was basically where I just stored everything and kept it and made sure that it was all there, and it was basically the basis for every single stage, which we did. Now, the NAS, that's the storage box which we had, which basically meant that we would have like an off the computer driver thing. So then if the computer did delete everything or it got lost, it would always be backed up to this box, which was actually quite helpful at times because people forgot to save them halfway through and it would be lost. And anyway, so this box, although we couldn't see it, it was there, and it's quite important to remember that it is there. So when I mention a scanner, I mean like the one on a printer. So I did quite a few drawings and I did a few notes on like revision cards. So I scanned them in to my website, because there's no point of doing that work if you're not going to show it. It might not be brilliant, but you've still thought about it and put effort into it, so you might as well mention it. Finally, I have the whiteboard. I only mentioned this a few times, or included it a few times, but I think that this was interesting, as I would just doodle or draw, but then they would be quite relevant things, so I'd want to include them. But as I hadn't drawn them on paper, it was obviously on the whiteboard, making it a little bit different. But anyway, so for online and planning, I had Google Slides, general online searches and everything, which is always helpful, embedding links, and Google Sheets. So the Google Slides, again, I just really love that format out of all of them, because I think that it really does look professional compared to a lot of different things. So that's why I like it. So I did need, again, to do a bit more research. Not research per se, but it's always just handy to have it there, and if you need to look something up quickly, it's just there. That's why I mentioned having like the general online access. Embedding links, some of it was to other pages which I've got on my magazine, but then others of it would be to my survey, for example, which is always quite handy. So to embed a website on your website, you have to click, because we use Google Sites, you have to click insert, and then there's 4 boxes which come up. One of them's text box, images, from Drive, and embed. obviously, it's the embed one. So when you click that, you can go by URL, which is like a normal web link, but then you can also get the full-on embedded code. Both of these work, and it's just nice to have a little bit more interaction, which the audience can have. So that's always something. And for the Google Sheets, this was on my, what's it called? The production schedule. So it was for that page, which is quite nice. And it just sort of gives you a visual idea for what you've done on what page. And yeah, I think it's nice. Okay, so moving on to production. So for the software in production, I use Bridge, InDesign, Photoshop, 360 video, screencast, podcast, time-lapse, and Final Cut Pro. One thing which is quite nice to see is how much software you're using and how it develops with all the whole process, if I'm honest. Just more and more accumulating. But anyway, so if I first talk about Bridge, this came quite in handy when I was selecting the images which I wanted to do, or which ones I wanted to use in my magazine. So it's all as well just having like a general contact sheet which you create in Photoshop, but you can't really see and compare the images, but Bridge lets you literally compare them if you need to or if you want to, which is always a good thing. Okay, so InDesign, obviously you need InDesign for your magazine, as that's how you can actually create the thing. So yeah, I thought that was pretty obvious why you needed that. It also, I took screenshots as I was going along, so I did a lot of InDesign, like showing my work in the drafting section. So I've got a lot of stuff for the InDesign in there. I've also got a bit in photo manipulation, but not as much. Moving on to Photoshop, this was basically the whole of photo manipulation and the contact sheets page, actually. So I found out that if you go into the top and click file or something, then automate, and then it says contact sheets. This is basically just how you create a contact sheet. You can obviously change the settings or the view of how you want it all to come out. So if you want, say, 6 pages, or not 6 pages, 6 images in a row, and then have 6 going down, or if you just want 5 in a row or 4, it's nice to play around and just do that with it. Okay, so moving on to 360 video. So I use this for my behind the scenes, and I've personally only seen this in a few places, but I've never done one of these videos before, so I thought it was pretty cool that you could. So basically, it involves the whole 360 camera. So it's got 2 cameras on it, which have got fisheye lens, and that makes them 180 or something like that. From there, you can, you can link them and cut them together to create a 360 video where you can follow the person around the room by literally clicking and holding the mouse, which is pretty cool. I'm not even gonna lie, that is pretty cool that you can do that. yeah, I think that was definitely a new piece of technology, and I'm glad that I did try it in the end. So next I had the screencast. This was basically just in my drafting, as it gave a little bit of an insight for what I'm thinking rather than just writing, and yeah, it just added a bit of variation, which I think it really did need, if I'm honest. Okay, so podcast, again, it's just so then I'm not constantly writing loads and loads, and it breaks it up a little bit, which is always good, actually. Always good. So after that, I had time lapses, which came in handy for the time lapse page, funnily enough. So I tried to do this for all of my photo shoots. I did miss a few if they were like out and about, but I did pretty well to record a few, which I'm quite happy with, actually. Okay, so then finally, again, I used Final Cut Pro. This ended up being quite useful for me as it was just at home, so it's quite easy and accessible for me. Moving on to the hardware for the production, I had a Canon DSLR 800, which is just the camera which we've been using for this whole time. So that was quite good. But then we also had all of the flashes, so the Godox D400s, and the the diffusers, mainly the umbrella diffusers, as it just makes the skin look a little bit softer and everything like that, which is always a good thing. Also used the permanent lights and the timers, like what's the name of them? The light triggers, that's what they're called. So that came in handy quite as well for our whole setup. Also used the backdrop, obviously, to make sure that we had that clean white background. The barn doors, the gels, which I did try but didn't like. The diffusers, I mentioned them. And the honeycomb grid. So all of this I used to come together to create the overall set, or the basis, for my photo shoots each time, which I did. Obviously, some of these variables would change depending on which photo shoot and what sort of feel I was going for the photos. So for Annabelle, I was focusing on like a really clean cut background, whereas for Beryl, I wanted quite an edgy feel to it. And then for Laura, I had to think about the speed as well as the shadows, which I wanted to catch. So it just depended on who I was taking the photos of and what I wanted to really focus the camera on. I also used my phone and the Mac during this stage. So my phone came in handy when I was doing the time lapses, and then, or for a few times actually, I recorded it normally, then I transferred it into Premiere, and then I sped the whole thing up to, I think I chose 5 minutes or something like that, which is always a good thing, always good. And then Mac, again, this was just so then I could use Final Cut Pro and Premiere and InDesign and Photoshop and Bridge, and yeah. I also used my phone, I forgot to mention this, for the 360 degrees camera, because you need to stitch the footage together. Which, as I was researching about this, it said that the best thing to do would be to download the app and just do it on your phone. And honestly, I found it really easy to do, I'm not gonna lie. So that was quite good that I learned how to do that. Also good just to play around with it. Now, for the online aspect of the production, this was mainly about embedding the links, and just general online use as normal. So like the embedding links I used on the behind the scenes to like import the videos in the time lapse themselves, in the article draft where I needed to put in the different pages and Word documents and everything, which is quite good. So I need to do all of that, which I was allowed to through the embedding links. I think that these all linked quite nicely together because they weren't just like the typical generic post. They made them all a little bit more different. So it's nice to see how they all work together and come together to create something very different, actually. Okay, so finally moving on to the evaluation. In this section for the software, I had a mix of podcasts, the equivalent to Acrobat, Final Cut Pro, and screencasts. So, although I've talked about 3 of these before, I just want to focus on the one which I haven't yet, which would be the equivalent to Acrobat. So this would mean that I would be able to edit and basically just another version of Screencast, if I'm honest, onto a document. So this came in handy when I was annotating and looking at my magazine in question 1, which was quite handy, if I'm honest. Quite handy just to talk about it all. Although I did write quite a lot for this section, so I talked about the gaps, which I didn't have time to mention. Which I think actually, using both of these, it did come together very nicely actually. I didn't feel as though I was pressured to do anything else, which is always good. Obviously, podcast and screencast, just so then I got a bit more variation and I'm not just speaking, not just typing, which is always good. So moving on to the hardware, I used my phone for the podcast, but then I used the Mac for the Final Cut Pro, screencast, and the equivalent of Acrobat. I think it's just something good to mention that the Mac has 17 CPU, 16 gigabytes RAW, 256 gigabytes hard drive, and a 6+12 network attached, which is pretty decent actually in the whole big scale of things. And it shows that the school really didn't hold back on the expenditure, which is always quite nice. So finally, when it came to online in this stage, I basically used Google Slides. This was in question number 1 and question number 3 in particular, as I wrote them all out before speaking about them, which, yeah. I think that these link well together in the whole scheme of things, and I'm glad that I definitely did use it. Yeah, so that sums up question 4.